welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. In the quiet town of Aix province, nestled in the south of France, Claire Dubois was known simply as La Veuve, the widow. She dressed in black silk, drove an aging but elegant Citroën, and lived in a spacious villa lined with lavender bushes and ceramic angels. Her voice was soft, her manner gracious, and her reputation spotless. No one suspected that the elegant woman who lit candles in the town chapel each Sunday was at the heart of one of Europe's most peculiar inheritance scams, one that targeted the dying, the grieving, and the gullible. It began in 2016, when Claire appeared in court to claim the estate of Henri Marchand, a wealthy recluse who had died without known heirs. Claire presented a will, dated 2 months before Henri's passing, stating she was his goddaughter and sole beneficiary. The will was neatly typed, legally formatted, and notarized. No one contested it. Claire inherited nearly 2.8 million euros in assets, mostly in real estate and antiques. She sold the properties swiftly and quietly, avoiding attention. The case would have gone unnoticed if not for a young paralegal named Thomas Miguel, who was digitizing probate records for a regional archive and noticed something unusual. Over 2 years, Thomas found 6 separate wills, each leaving estates to a woman named Claire Dubois. Each man had died under different circumstances, one of old age, another of a stroke, a third in a car accident. None of the men had known family left. In each case, Claire appeared shortly after the funeral with a notarized will, claiming to be either a goddaughter, a distant niece, or a devoted caregiver. The handwriting varied, but the formatting was almost identical. The notary changed each time, but the witness names on the documents were often the same. Thomas alerted his supervisor, who initially dismissed the pattern as coincidence. But Thomas persisted, digging into public records. He found that Claire had received inheritances totaling nearly 12 million euro over 8 years, all from elderly men who had no surviving family and whose estates had gone uncontested. Eventually, local authorities were notified. A quiet investigation was launched in late 2019. Undercover officers interviewed acquaintances of the deceased. The pattern was chilling. Each man had encountered Claire shortly before his health declined, at a hospital, at a pharmacy, or at church. Sometimes she volunteered as a caregiver. Other times she claimed to be a friend of the family. In each case, she ingratiated herself during the final weeks or months of life. But proving fraud in inheritance cases is notoriously difficult, especially in France, where inheritance laws allow wide latitude in naming heirs. The wills were notarized and, on paper, perfectly valid. Investigators needed something more concrete. Then, in 2020, an anonymous letter arrived at the Marseille prefecture. It was postmarked from Spain and written in block letters. The letter claimed Claire had paid a notary to forge documents, and that she had used aliases in earlier schemes dating back to 2009 in Belgium. Digging further, police uncovered Claire's real name, Annelies de Vries, born in Rotterdam, Netherlands. She had changed her identity after a suspended sentence for fraud in Ghent in 2007. Under her new name, she had traveled through Belgium, Luxembourg, and eventually France, where she reinvented herself as Claire Dubois, a grieving widow with a sad smile and an uncanny ability to find lonely, dying men. Authorities tapped her phone, monitored her banking activity, and eventually uncovered the heart of her operation. She worked with 2 accomplices, a retired notary named Jean-Baptiste Roux and a former nurse who helped Claire identify potential targets through hospice care networks. The nurse provided names of terminally ill patients with no family connections. Claire would then position herself as a companion, sometimes religious, sometimes romantic. Once trust was established, she would produce a will, usually under the pretext of ensuring their memory lived on. The documents were drafted and notarized by Roux, then placed with lawyers under Claire's instructions. The scam was careful, patient, and always quiet. No flashy spending. No luxurious trips. Claire lived modestly, never drawing attention. She claimed the inheritances in legal channels and paid taxes without protest. In early 2021, French authorities arrested Claire at her home. The villa was sparsely decorated, save for photographs of elderly men, none of them labeled. She offered no resistance. When asked why she did it, she reportedly replied, "They had no one. I gave them peace." At trial, prosecutors detailed how she had orchestrated over 15 million euros in fraudulent inheritances from at least 9 estates. The evidence included falsified deathbed letters, witness statements that were completely fabricated, and bank transfers from her shell companies in Andorra. Her defense argued she had truly cared for the men, that she was merely formalizing what they verbally wished. But the witnesses told another story. In one case, a neighbor testified that Claire had discouraged a dying man from calling his estranged daughter, claiming it would only make her sadder. In another, she instructed a nurse not to notify extended family until after the funeral. The jury was unmoved. Claire Dubois, Annalise de Vries, was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Her accomplices received lighter sentences in exchange for cooperation. Several estates were contested retroactively, but in some cases, the assets had already been liquidated and moved offshore. To this day, local residents in Aix-en Provence still speak of Claire with mixed feelings. Some remember her kindness at church. Others remember how many funerals she attended, always dressed in black, always alone. And no one, not even the authorities, knows if all her victims have been identified. She had a gift for finding the forgotten, and a talent for making their silence profitable. The quiet maestro of Midtown. Mornings on Lexington Avenue began with the crisp shuffle of newspapers and the muted clack of polished shoes, and no one wore confidence as seamlessly as Bernard Lawrence Madoff. From the brushed steel elevator doors to the hushed carpeted halls of his 41st floor office, the financier moved like a conductor approaching a well-rehearsed symphony. Secretaries greeted him with the soft reverence one might grant an esteemed maestro. Investors, meanwhile, spoke of him in tones ordinarily reserved for clockwork miracles. Never a missed dividend, never a hint of turbulence, only steady, enviable returns. Hidden behind the glass wall of Madoff Securities, the real orchestra was smaller than outsiders imagined. 2 computer terminals, an aging dot matrix printer, and a handful of trusted insiders. There were no armies of analysts breaking down price charts, no rows of whirring servers modeling risk. When clients asked how the operation remained so lean, Bernard offered a knowing smile and murmured about proprietary algorithms, a mysterious split-strike conversion strategy, and decades-old instincts too subtle to explain. Success, he implied, was like a magician's flourish, visible only in the outcome, never in the mechanics. Across town, Frank Casey, a portfolio manager at a rival firm, stared at the monthly statements his boss had just received from Madoff. The numbers glowed with an almost narcotic calm. Up a little during rallies, down barely at all during crashes, always settling at a pleasant middle. Frank's instincts twitched. Markets breathed in ragged lungfuls. They never exhaled with such precision. He phoned Harry Markopoulos, a quiet quantitative analyst with a knack for seeing patterns much as a chess grandmaster sees empty squares. In an hour, Harry had crunched the figures, then leaned back, ashen. "Statistically impossible," he whispered. "Either he's a genius beyond math or he's faking the notes." Harry drafted 17 pages of analysis, each conclusion darker than the last. He noted that Madoff claimed to buy billions in blue-chip stocks, yet public trade records showed no such volume. He observed that the algorithm delivered positive returns even on days when the underlying options market had been flat-out closed. He mailed the dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission, confident the evidence would spark an immediate inquiry. It did not. At the SEC's regional office, the report landed on an overburdened examiner's desk. The numbers seemed complex, the claims audacious, yet Madoff's reputation gleamed like polished brass. He had once chaired NASDAQ, he played golf with senators, his Rolodex read like a who's who of Wall Street. The examiner, pressed by deadlines and reluctant to question a pillar of the community, filed the matter under no action. In a building full of ticking clocks, no one leaned in to hear the faintest gear grinding offbeat. Years slipped by. Madoff's client list swelled. Charities, retirement funds, European banks, film stars, small-town widows. Money flowed in like a tide, never seeming to recede. Each month the dot matrix printer rattled out statements adorned with comforting gains. Behind the scenes, Bernard shuffled new deposits to pay withdrawals, a simple hand-to-mouth ballet concealed beneath layers of prestige. He told himself the market would someday deliver real profits and square the ledger. Until then, perception was reality, and reality sat quietly muzzled. December 2008 arrived like black ice. The global financial crisis had turned investors jittery, and redemption requests piled on Madoff's desk faster than the incoming wires. He watched the spreadsheets with mounting dread. 17 billion due out, only a trickle coming in. The orchestra had reached the coda, and there were no final crescendos left, only silence. One gray afternoon he summoned his sons, Mark and Andrew, into a corner office heavy with unspoken tension. He confessed that the business they had championed at cocktail parties and charity galas was, in fact, one big lie. The sons met the revelation with stupefied horror, like passengers discovering the captain had abandoned the helm mid-voyage. They consulted lawyers, then contacted the authorities. The next morning, FBI agents walked through the revolving doors of the Lipstick Building. Bernard, still composed in his tailored suit, met them without protest. "I'm here to confess," he said, the words falling softly yet echoing through decades of complicity. In the filing cabinets around him, towers of fraudulent statements slept like paper fossils awaiting exhumation. News of the arrest detonated across the world. Pensioners in Florida stared at television screens, clutching statements that had once promised security. European banks froze, unsure how many billions had evaporated overnight. Charitable foundations canceled grants. Universities slashed budgets. The illusion's collapse echoed like a cracked bell, tolling for every trusting soul who had followed the maestro's baton. In a Manhattan courtroom, the judge asked Madoff why he had done it. He answered with a slight lift of the shoulders, as though the question pertained to an especially intricate knot. "I thought it would end soon," he said. "I thought I could fix it." The gavel came down, sentencing him to 150 years, a number as vast and abstract as the returns he once promised. Years later, Harry Markopolos still walks past the SEC building, remembering the dossier that gathered dust. The lesson lingers like an afterimage against glass. When charisma outpaces scrutiny, even the sharpest eyes can grow dazzled. Markets will always hum with risk, but trust, once breached, reverberates far beyond balance sheets. That quiet truth, spoken in back offices and whispered across dinner tables, endures long after the maestro's final note has faded from Midtown's skyline. The Phantom Prophets of Munich. Marcus Braun liked to arrive before dawn, while Munich streets still glimmered with dew. From the rooftop terrace of Wirecard's glass headquarters, he could see the Alps turn blush pink, a view he claimed sharpened his strategic mind. Inside, motivational slogans glowed on digital billboards: cashless, seamless, fearless. Investors repeated the words like scripture because Wirecard seemed to live them. The company processed online payments for everyone from travel sites to video game platforms, and its share price had rocketed faster than any German tech stock since the dot-com era. To analysts on quarterly calls, Braun's Austrian accent carried a soothing certainty. Revenues were scaling. Margins were expanding. Most mystifying of all, profits appeared to pour in from Asia, Singapore, Manila, Dubai, regions Braun described as hypergrowth corridors. He rarely offered detail and no one pushed hard. The numbers sparkled bright enough to blind curiosity. Yet among the muted hum of laptops and lattes, a ghost story began to circulate. A London short seller named Fraser Paring published a thin report suggesting that Wirecard's Asian subsidiaries were shells, offices with borrowed staff, cupboards holding dusty routers, bank accounts padded by round-trip transfers. The market shrugged. Wirecard's public relations team framed the allegations as fantasies of market manipulators, and German regulators, unfamiliar with open conflict between shorts and tech darlings, actually launched an investigation, not into Wirecard but into the critics who were betting against it. Still, smoke lingered. At the Financial Times, reporter Dan McCrum found the case too strange to ignore. He traveled to Manila expecting a bustling payment hub. Instead, he discovered a single-room office lit by a flickering bulb and guarded by a sleepy security guard who had never heard of Wirecard. In Singapore, anonymous sources slipped him documents. Invoices altered with correction fluid, signatures copied and pasted, balance sheets where millions appeared overnight like stage props lowered by ropes. McCrum's editors gave him space. The FT began running a serialized investigation that read like a thriller unfolding in real time. Each article landed with a thud in Wirecard's boardroom. Braun, tall and lean in his trademark black turtleneck, called emergency video conferences. He denounced the newspaper's colonial mindset and suggested enemies were conspiring to bring down a rare continental European tech success. His legal team fired off injunctions. Private detectives tailed journalists through hotel lobbies. The louder the accusations grew, the more fiercely Wirecard's share price yo-yoed, yet it somehow always rebounded as though reality itself obeyed Braun's self-assurance. Inside the company, a few accountants nursed quiet insomnia. A controller named Emily Hauer noticed that certain Asian earnings reversed direction moments before books closed. like chess pieces swept back to their starting squares. When she asked for backup invoices, a supervisor replied with a smile. Focus on the bigger picture, Ja? Emily did what many employees did. She focused on her deadlines, on her mortgage, on the prestige of working for Germany's brightest star. Doubt became a private echo she learned to ignore. The tipping point arrived in early 2020, when Wirecard's auditor EY prepared to sign off on another triumphant annual report. A routine request went out to a Manila bank. Please confirm that 1.9 billion euros sits safely in escrow, earmarked for Wirecard. Days passed. No confirmation. Braun produced a PDF that looked correct, but the bank insisted the document was forged. The money, nearly a quarter of Wirecard's balance sheet, did not and had never existed. The revelation ripped through Germany like a winter storm. Wirecard halted trading. Its board convened an emergency call that ran until sunrise. Braun, facing questions no euphemism could smother, resigned with a clipped statement about restoring stakeholder confidence. Hours later, Bavarian police arrested him on suspicion of market manipulation and false accounting. He appeared in court wearing the same black turtleneck, now rumpled, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He maintained that the funds were in transit, lost in bureaucratic limbo. Meanwhile, Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's enigmatic chief operating officer, vanished. Colleagues said he left headquarters carrying only a slim laptop bag, nodding courteously to the receptionist as though stepping out for coffee. Within 48 hours he was rumored in Vienna, then Minsk, then on a private jet to Moscow. Interpol issued a red notice, but Marsalek slipped into legend, a modern Kaiser Soze dissolving into the haze of intelligence gossip and encrypted phone calls. In bankruptcy court, administrators pieced through server logs, emails, and PDF invoices that crackled with the stale scent of toner. They discovered that many of Wirecard's supposed partners were brass plate firms run by friends of friends, circular routes where money left Germany in the morning and re-entered by dusk, wearing a different costume. Genuine revenues existed, but they were dwarfed by the fictional kind, inflated to meet the market's expectations, and Braun's vision of boundless growth. Employees stared at screens displaying zeroed-out retirement plans. Pension funds wrote frantic memos. Germany's political class, which had hailed Wirecard as proof Europe could birth tech champions, held tense hearings broadcast on late-night television. Regulators admitted they had trusted too easily and verified too little. The Financial Times, once sued for defamation, collected journalism awards, though Macron admitted the victory felt hollow. The facts were always there, he said. We just kept shining a torch until others were willing to look. Today, the Wirecard complex stands half-occupied, its lobby plants watered by a skeleton crew of caretakers. Visitors still pause at the slogan etched in steel above the entrance: seamless, cashless, fearless, and marvel at how confidence can solidify into concrete, glass, and employee badges before evaporating overnight. For those who followed the saga, one image persists. 1.9 billion phantom euros, neither here nor there, a mirage that lured a nation across a desert of wishful thinking. The lesson drifts through conference rooms and classrooms alike. Trust is earned in teaspoons, lost in floods, and when numbers appear too perfect, even daylight may be an illusion. Smoke rings over Houston. At sunrise, the mirrored tower at 1400 Smith Street caught the first blush of Texas light, turning it into a column of gold above downtown Houston. Every weekday, employees funneled through the revolving doors of Enron Center with lattes in hand and headsets at the ready, convinced they were part of an energy revolution. In the lobby, plasma screens scrolled global electricity prices the way other offices post weather forecasts. The future, Enron insisted, could be traded like corn or copper, and it was theirs to monetize. Jeff Skilling, the company's razor-sharp president, moved among the cubicles as though walking a trading floor made of pure possibility. He called employees the smartest guys in the room, a compliment that felt like a knighthood. Ken Lay, the avuncular chairman, supplied grandfatherly reassurance, telling civic leaders that deregulation would liberate consumers and enrich shareholders in one elegant sweep. The pair made a seamless duo, Skilling the rocket engine, Lay the polished fuselage, propelling Enron stock into the stratosphere. Inside the labyrinth of spreadsheets, however, certain numbers always seem to float just beyond the reach of logic. Risk manager Vince Kaminsky, a lanky Polish economist with a quiet fondness for Monte Carlo simulations, noticed that projected profits popped up the moment contracts were signed, long before any gas flowed or electrons surged down wires. Skilling called the practice mark-to-market. branding it an accounting innovation. To Kaminsky, it felt like sketching tomorrow's harvest into today's granary ledger. He voiced concerns, but supervisors suggested he focus on value creation rather than bookkeeping shadows. Hundreds of miles away, Fortune reporter Bethany McLean stared at Enron's public filings and felt her temples tighten. How, she wondered, did an energy trader sustain technology sector price earnings multiples? Her now famous question, how exactly does Enron make its money? Carved a hairline crack in the company's gleaming facade. Skilling dismissed the inquiry as naive, labeling McLean and her editors unbelievers. On conference calls, he peppered analysts with boasts about bandwidth trading, weather derivatives, and a website called Enron Online that would make markets spin faster than thought itself. Behind the boasting stood Andy Fasto, the chief financial officer, with an easy grin and a mind wired for complexity. Fasto had quietly assembled a maze of special-purpose entities, LJAM, Raptor, Jedi, to which Enron sold underperforming assets at fabricated values. The entities, financed largely with Enron stock collateral, dutifully generated paper gains that looped back into the parent company's income statement. At holiday parties, Fasto toasted innovation, while partners pocketed bonuses for swapping chess pieces they already owned. By the summer of 2001, the machine began to shudder. California's energy grid convulsed in rolling blackouts, and angry legislators questioned whether Enron traders had manufactured scarcity by idling plants and rerouting megawatts under code names like Death Star and Fat Boy. Skilling, suddenly weary, announced his resignation in August, citing personal reasons. Investors barely blinked. Ken Lay was returning to the CEO chair, and Wall Street still believed the narrative of unstoppable growth. Then an internal memo reached Lay's desk. Sharon Watkins, a senior vice president with a talent for pattern recognition, warned that Fasto's partnerships could implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She urged an outside investigation before auditors or journalists uncovered the rot. Lay thanked her, formed a committee, and issued reassuring statements, but the spell had begun to break. Rating agencies placed Enron on credit watch. Counterparties demanded more collateral. The stock price, which had once grazed $90, wobbled like a tired boxer. October arrived, and with it a surprise. Enron revealed a $1 billion write-down linked to Fasto's entities. Within weeks it announced that years of earnings would be restated downward. The market's verdict was swift and final. Shares tumbled to single digits. Traders who had worn Patagonia vests now checked job boards between phone calls. Fasto was forced out, clutching a severance agreement already tinged with legal peril. On the first Monday of December 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11. Employees stood on the sidewalk watching moving vans haul out filing cabinets, the autumn wind scattering resumes printed on pricey linen stock. Many had invested their retirement savings almost entirely in company shares, encouraged by pep talks that blurred the line between loyalty and risk. As the price slid toward zero, so did decades of nest eggs. Federal investigators swooped in like winter crows. Emails surfaced with traders whooped about Grandma Millie being overcharged for electricity. Spreadsheets revealed assets named after Star Wars villains. Voicemail greetings once recorded in tones of triumph now sounded like relics from a vanished planet. Skilling and Lay were indicted for conspiracy and fraud. Fasto struck a plea deal, mapping the shell game in exchange for leniency. During the trial, jurors listened to jargon about off-balance sheet vehicles, but the core story came down to a simple deceit. Revenue had been wished into being, and risk had been shoved into closets labeled partnership. In May 2006, the verdict landed, guilty on nearly every count. Lay died of a heart attack before sentencing. Skilling received 24 years, later reduced but still severe. Fasto served time and emerged into a quieter life of lectures on ethical failure. The Enron sign was pried off its headquarters, sold at auction to a memorabilia collector who kept it in climate-controlled gloom. Houston's skyline remains, yet locals say a ghostly shimmer lingers where Enron's beacon once glowed. MBA students study the case as a cautionary tale, but the lesson resists neat summary. It whispers that brilliance untethered from humility can calcify into arrogance, that numbers bent too far will eventually spring back like steel, and that trust, slow to build, swift to shatter, may be the most volatile commodity ever traded. The sun still rises over Smith Street each dawn, painting the glass towers gold. But commuters who pass that block often quicken their pace, reminded that not every glimmer means morning. Sometimes it is only the last flicker of a candle burning out. Crimson vials in Palo Alto. Silicon Valley wakes early, and so did Elizabeth Holmes. At 6:30 each morning she strode through the glass doors of Theranos headquarters wearing a black turtleneck and an expression that suggested sunrise was simply another milestone on her schedule. The lobby smelled of fresh ground coffee and institutional confidence. Frosted panels bore the company's promise in minimalist gray. One tiny drop changes everything. Employees repeated the phrase like a protective charm. Investors turned it into gospel. The concept seemed disarmingly humane. Instead of vials of blood drawn from crooks of arms, Theranos would extract a single fingerstick droplet, whisper it through a toaster-sized device called the Edison, and conjure hundreds of lab results within minutes. No more anxious waits, no more bruised veins, just data, swift and near painless. Holmes, with her low contralto voice and unwavering gaze, presented the mission as equal parts moonshot and moral duty. She spoke of curing diagnostics inequities, of saving the lives of soldiers in desert tents, of elderly patients spared weekly needle sticks. Her language was aspirational yet oddly specific, as though the future had already signed the paperwork. Inside the building, however, the Edison machines were temperamental creatures. Some days they whirred obediently, other days they clogged, overheated, or spit out error codes that sounded like distress calls. Engineers in hoodies worked under constant hush orders, bound by non-disclosure agreements thick enough to stun a bull. When results misfired, supervisors instructed analysts to rerun samples on third-party hospital equipment hidden behind a partition, then paste the outside numbers into Theranos-branded reports. The sleight of hand was rationalized as a temporary bridge. Once the bugs are fixed, everything will be real. Concern first surfaced among the phlebotomists, irony not lost on them, when patients at Walgreens testing centers complained of wild swings in results. A pharmacist in Phoenix saw a cholesterol reading soar 80 points overnight. A pregnant woman in Palo Alto received alternating notices that she was both Rh positive and Rh negative. Queries traveled up the chain of command only to dissolve in jargon. Analyte interference, sample integrity variances, proprietary calibration cycles. Doubt flattened under layers of deference. But in Wall Street conference rooms, the excitement was palpable. Former secretaries of state joined the board. A media mogul put down $20 million after a single afternoon chat. Coverage on morning television shows captured Holmes against sterile white backdrops, her blue eyes magnified by studio lights, her words rolling out like silk spun by an obliging spider. Reporters marveled at the valuations. First 3 billion, then 6, then 9, without noticing that Theranos had never published peer-reviewed data. The math of hope, it seemed, required no footnotes. A quiet fracture opened when Tyler Schultz, a young lab associate with a famous last name, spotted results that did not match control samples by orders of magnitude. He approached a supervisor who said, "Focus on your lane." Tyler called his grandfather, George Schultz, the revered former Secretary of State and proud Theranos director. The elder listened politely yet suggested Tyler trust the leadership team. Elizabeth had vision, and vision sometimes outruns paperwork. Unconvinced, Tyler contacted John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal, a reporter notorious for burrowing beneath shiny surfaces. Carreyrou began with public filings, then methodically tracked down former employees who had left under non-disclosure clouds. Conversation by conversation, a narrative emerged. Lab doors locked with motion sensors, whistleblowers threatened with lawsuits, blood samples diluted like cheap wine before testing to make numbers land within reference ranges. One scientist described dropping a pipette and realizing the device on which half of Silicon Valley's dreams rested was no more reliable than a kettle. Carreyrou's first story landed online one October dawn in 2015. In Theranos headquarters, alarms went off, figuratively at first, then literally as security teams combed badge logs to identify leakers. Holmes convened an all-hands meeting in the cafeteria. Monitors behind her displayed giant white text on red. "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, then you change the world." She urged staff to keep building. The applause was earnest but not unanimous. Regulators could not ignore the noise now. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sent inspectors to the company's Newark, California lab. They found unqualified technicians performing complex tests, quality control records altered with backdated initials, and a refrigerator of reagents kept at room temperature because the cooler fan squealed too loudly. CMS issued a scathing report and revoked the lab's federal certification. Walgreens froze its rollout. The spell began to fracture like safety glass. Investors, once hypnotized by the narrative, demanded explanations. Holmes stood on stages repeating phrases, "This is simply growing pains, innovation is messy," yet her voice carried a new quiver as though the contralto had discovered an upper register of doubt. Lawsuits gathered in clusters. The board, heavy with dignitaries and used to scientific audits, sought outside counsel. In 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes with massive fraud, alleging she had raised over $700 million on a foundation of exaggerated claims. She settled without admitting wrongdoing but surrendered voting control and millions of shares. Criminal indictments arrived soon after. In federal court, prosecutors played jurors a looping montage. Holmes on television promising accuracy 10 times better than top laboratories, slide decks showing military contracts that never existed, emails in which executives rehearsed talking points rather than troubleshooting failures. Former colleagues testified that skepticism was labeled betrayal. Holmes's defense argued she had believed in the technology with every cell in her body. The phrase, meant to conjure conviction, instead evoked the cellular chaos the Edison could never measure correctly. The verdict, guilty on 4 counts of fraud, echoed through Silicon Valley corridors still lined with motivational posters. Holmes, once the youngest self-made female billionaire on Earth, faced a future measured not in valuations but in years. The Edison boxes, once wrapped in secrecy tarps, were hauled into evidence storage, inert as stage props after the curtain falls. Yet the story's chill lingers not in court transcripts but in ordinary clinics, where nurses prick fingers and patients ask half-joking, "This isn't one of those Theranos things, right?" It lingers in pitch decks where entrepreneurs invoke disruption as shield and sword. For all the talk of blood, the heart of the tale is simpler. Trust pumps quietly, unseen, until it is drained by a promise too golden to test. And when the vial is emptied, no device, however sleek, can refill it. The art of the deal breaker, the Noodler Gallery scandal. For nearly 2 decades, a woman named Glafa Rosales walked into one of the most prestigious art galleries in New York City carrying secrets worth millions. She wasn't dressed like a mogul. Her English was heavily accented. But she came bearing masterpieces, unknown works by legends like Rothko, Pollock, and de Kooning. The Noodler Gallery, which had served Manhattan's elite for over 160 years, took her at her word. They bought, they sold, they profited. And no one asked too many questions, until it all came crashing down. It began quietly in the mid-1990s. Rosales claimed to represent an anonymous collector from Mexico who had supposedly purchased these never-before-seen abstract expressionist works directly from the artists in the 1950s and 60s. She told the gallery that the mysterious collector had died and left the art to his son, who now wanted to sell discreetly. To Noodler's director and Friedman, the story had just enough mystery to feel true, and the paintings were undeniably compelling. Collectors snapped them up. A Rothko for $8.3 million, a Motherwell for $5.5 million. Between 1994 and 2009, more than 30 paintings passed through Noodler's hands in this fashion, totaling nearly $80 million. But behind the canvas, a far different picture was forming. Rosales wasn't backed by a wealthy heir. The paintings hadn't come from Mexico, or any museum or known collection. Instead, they were being created in a garage in Queens by a man named Pei Chen, a little-known Chinese painter with a talent for mimicry. Paid only a few $1,000s per work, Chen replicated the signature styles of mid-century American masters, even aging the canvases with tea bags and heating them to give the paint a vintage texture. As the fake paintings circulated through the high-end market, suspicions began to mount. Some art experts questioned stylistic inconsistencies. Provenance documents seemed flimsy or forged. When a Rothko sold to a collector named Domenico de Sol turned out to have no verifiable history, the illusion began to crumble. De Sol sued. Others followed. And when the FBI stepped in, the fraud unraveled at an astonishing pace. Investigators found that none of the supposed masterpieces had been cataloged, photographed, or exhibited before Rosales introduced them. Their backstory, meticulously crafted, collapsed under scrutiny. Rosales eventually confessed and pleaded guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. She had personally earned over $30 million from the scam. Friedman, Noodler's director, insisted she had been duped too. But questions remained. How could a respected gallery have failed to authenticate such high-value works? Why weren't independent experts brought in? Did they believe the story, or simply want to? By 2011, the damage was irreversible. Noodler, once a cornerstone of the American art scene, quietly shut its doors after 165 years in operation. Qin, the painter at the center of it all, fled to China before he could be arrested. Though charged in absentia, he has never stood trial. He later told reporters he was just trying to earn a living. He never expected his imitations to pass as originals, let alone sell for millions. In the aftermath, the art world took a hard look in the mirror. Collectors became more cautious. Galleries began rethinking how they verified artwork. But the scars remained. Dozens of forgeries are still unaccounted for, hanging silently in private homes or storage facilities, their true origins unknown. The Nodeler case didn't just expose a sophisticated fraud. It revealed the deep vulnerabilities of an industry built on trust, taste, and narrative. A woman with no formal training and a painter in a garage had fooled billionaires, experts, and institutions. Not through violence or hacking, but through charm, mystery, and the promise of something rare. In the end, the most convincing part of the scam wasn't the paint, it was the story. A lost collection, a grieving heir, a chance to own a forgotten masterpiece. People believed it because they wanted it to be true. And in the art world, belief is everything. The socialite who swindled the city, Anna Sorokin, aka Anna Delvey. In 2013, a young woman with an odd accent and bottomless confidence checked into Manhattan's most luxurious hotels. She dressed in Celine, tipped in $100 bills, and introduced herself as Anna Delvey, a German heiress managing her trust fund while building an ambitious art and social club. To anyone listening, she was European royalty reborn in the Instagram age, cosmopolitan, mysterious, and wealthy beyond measure. But Anna wasn't German. She wasn't an heiress. And her money didn't exist. Her real name was Anna Sorokin, born in Russia and raised in a modest suburb of Germany. She moved to New York under the guise of being a fashion intern, but soon reinvented herself. She created the Delvey Foundation, which she claimed would be an elite arts and culture center, complete with exhibitions, residencies, and private dining experiences. She just needed investors. And in Manhattan's hungry social scene, she found them. Over 4 years, Anna lived lavishly on smoke and mirrors. She stayed in 5-star hotels without a working credit card, chartered private jets she never paid for, and promised wire transfers that never arrived. Her wardrobe dazzled. Her Instagram glowed. She tipped doormen, concierges, and hairdressers with the confidence of someone who had millions. But behind the scenes, her debts were piling up, and her lies were growing more tangled. What made Anna so convincing wasn't just her wardrobe or her persona. It was the way she manipulated people's desire to be part of something elite. She talked fluently about art and fashion. She knew the right names to drop, the right wine to order, the right tone to strike with bankers. Her email signature referenced high-powered lawyers and bankers in Switzerland. When questioned, she became offended. How dare anyone doubt a Delvey? She targeted not only financiers but friends. One of them, a photo editor named Rachel Williams, agreed to accompany Anna on a trip to Morocco. Anna promised it was all expenses paid, until the hotel bill reached over $60,000 and Anna's cards began declining. Rachel, under pressure and stranded abroad, ended up footing much of the bill. Later, she realized she'd never see a cent returned. Anna's downfall came gradually. Hotel managers who had once looked the other way began demanding payment. Restaurants and stores reported bounced checks. When she tried to secure a $22 million loan from a major bank, the due diligence finally exposed her web of fabrications. Her fake documents, invented family office, and phantom trust fund all collapsed under scrutiny. In 2018, she was arrested in a sting operation in Los Angeles, where she had fled after skipping multiple court dates. Prosecutors charged her with multiple counts of grand larceny and theft of services. During the trial, Anna maintained her persona. She hired a stylist to plan her courtroom outfits and demanded the judge delay proceedings if she wasn't properly dressed. In 2019, she was convicted on several major charges and sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison. But by then, the public had become obsessed with her story. Some saw her as a con artist. Others saw her as a symbol. Someone who exposed how easily wealth and status could be faked in a city built on appearances. Netflix bought the rights to her story before the trial even ended. Tabloids debated whether she was a villain or simply a savvy survivor. After serving just over 3 years, she was released, then detained again for overstaying her visa. Today, she continues to build a public persona, writing, speaking, and maintaining a kind of infamous celebrity. The Anna Delvey saga wasn't just about money. It was about illusion. About how, in certain circles, appearance outweighs truth, and how far someone can go with just the right accent, a designer outfit, and the nerve to never break character. In the end, Anna never needed a trust fund. All she needed was belief. And in New York City for a while, belief was enough to buy her everything. The accountant who cooked Europe's books, the Wirecard scandal. 4 years, Germany had been looking for a tech giant of its own, something to rival Silicon Valley. In Wirecard, they thought they had found it. A digital payment processor based in Munich, Wirecard promised to be the future of finance. Its brash CEO, Markus Braun, pitched it as a European innovator that would replace the old guard of banks and become a global leader in fintech. Wirecard wasn't just another startup, it was a rising star on the German DAX index, rubbing shoulders with giants like BMW and Siemens. Its stock price soared. It acquired companies in Asia and the Middle East. It claimed explosive growth, particularly in markets where cash was still king. Investors poured in billions, and Germany's financial regulators gave it their implicit blessing. But beneath the surface, something was off. And when the truth finally came out in 2020, it wasn't just a case of corporate fraud, it was the biggest financial scandal in modern German history. The cracks started to show slowly. Journalists at the Financial Times began publishing investigations into Wirecard's murky finances as early as 2015. They noticed inconsistencies, subsidiaries with no real offices, revenue numbers that didn't match local data, and business partners that seemed to exist only on paper. Whenever these stories appeared, Wirecard responded with lawsuits, aggressive denials, and accusations of market manipulation. At one point, the company even hired private investigators to tail reporters. For years, this tactic worked. Wirecard positioned itself as a victim of a conspiracy, an upstart German firm being unfairly targeted by Anglo-American media. The German financial watchdog, BaFin, took the company's side. Instead of probing Wirecard, BaFin launched investigations into the journalists and short sellers who were sounding the alarm. Behind closed doors, however, executives were orchestrating a fraud so large, it almost defied belief. Wirecard claimed to process payments for merchants all over the world, especially in Southeast Asia. But a huge portion of these payments weren't actually processed by Wirecard itself. They were supposedly handled by third-party partners. This arrangement, while unusual, was accepted at face value by investors and auditors alike. When Ernst & Young, Wirecard's auditors, asked to verify over 1.9 billion euros supposedly held in trust accounts in the Philippines, they were given documentation showing the money existed. But it didn't. The documents were forged. The bank accounts were fake. And the money, nearly a quarter of the company's total assets, had never existed at all. In June 2020, Wirecard finally admitted the truth. The 1.9 billion euros was missing and likely never existed. Within days, the company filed for insolvency. Its stock plummeted. Markus Braun resigned and was quickly arrested. But the most sensational part was still to come. Wirecard COO Jan Marsalek disappeared just before the scandal broke. It soon emerged that he had been the architect of much of the deception. Charismatic and secretive, Marsalek had long cultivated relationships in the shadows. He claimed to work with intelligence agencies. He traveled to conflict zones. He talked about secret military operations and had contacts in Russia, Libya, and beyond. After fleeing Germany, Marsalek was placed on Interpol's most wanted list. He vanished into a web of international hiding spots. Reports later suggested he had escaped to Russia with the help of intelligence networks, where he remains under protection to this day. Some believe he's alive and well in a mansion near Moscow. Others suspect he's working with, or being shielded by, state actors. The fallout was massive. Germany's financial oversight agencies were humiliated. Politicians demanded reforms. BaFin's leadership was replaced. Investors lost billions. And the reputation of German corporate governance took a deep hit. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the Wirecard scandal was how long it went undetected, and how many people looked the other way. Banks, regulators, auditors, and institutional investors all missed or ignored red flags. Wirecard had become a symbol of national pride, and no one wanted to question it too closely. In the aftermath, prosecutors opened dozens of cases. Braun is currently standing trial in Munich, denying personal wrongdoing and blaming the missing COO. Employees revealed how they had been pressured to fabricate numbers and produce fake documents to satisfy auditors. The company, once valued at over 24 billion euros, was now worth less than zero. Wirecard wasn't just a financial fraud. It was a psychological one. A masterclass in how charisma, national ego, and regulatory failure can create a perfect storm. 4 years, the company told a story that people wanted to believe, of German innovation, unstoppable growth, and a future led by fintech. That story turned out to be fiction. And by the time the truth emerged, the damage was done, not just to wallets but to trust. The queen of Cryptopia, Ruja Ignatova, and the OneCoin scam. In the crowded world of cryptocurrency, where innovation often outpaces regulation, few figures have risen and fallen as dramatically as Dr. Ruja Ignatova. With a Harvard education, a glittering wardrobe, and the eloquence of a seasoned diplomat, she promised the world a revolution. Her invention, OneCoin, wasn't just another cryptocurrency, it was, according to her, the Bitcoin killer. 4 years, investors from over 175 countries poured billions of dollars into the project. But OneCoin was never built on blockchain. It wasn't even a real cryptocurrency. It was a Ponzi scheme disguised as a tech miracle, and Ruja, its glamorous, mysterious creator, vanished just before the house of cards collapsed. The story begins in 2014. Bitcoin was still a niche obsession, and few people truly understood how it worked. Ruja Ignatova seized that gap in public knowledge. With her PhD in law, fluent English, and a charismatic stage presence, she pitched OneCoin as a simplified, secure, and globally accessible digital currency. It would, she claimed, democratize finance and bring banking to the unbanked. Ruja didn't rely on traditional marketing. Instead, she adopted a multi-level marketing model, encouraging users to recruit friends and family. The more people you brought in, the more money you made. She hosted lavish conferences in Dubai, London, and Singapore, walking on stage in glittering gowns, likening herself to a tech messiah. Thousands of people cheered her on, often without understanding how cryptocurrency worked, or noticing that they never actually received any coins they could trade on open markets. Unlike Bitcoin, OneCoin had no publicly verifiable blockchain. Transactions couldn't be tracked. The coins only existed in an internal database controlled by the company. Yet Ruja kept promising a public listing that would send OneCoin values soaring. Investors were told they were getting in early, before the inevitable boom. In reality, the money wasn't going toward any crypto development. It was being funneled through offshore accounts, spent on luxury properties, yachts, jewelry, and Swiss bank accounts. Internal emails later revealed Ruja referring to OneCoin as trashy coin and admitting to colleagues that they were lying through our teeth. Still, the scheme worked, especially in regions where financial literacy was low and trust in traditional banks was weak. In Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, people invested life savings. Churches promoted it. Villages pooled money to buy packages, hoping for future wealth. By 2016, OneCoin claimed to have over 3 million users and had raised more than $4.4 billion. But behind the scenes, international investigators were circling. Whistleblowers came forward. The UK, Germany, and the US all began probing OneCoin's claims. Still, Ruja insisted everything was legitimate. Then, in October 2017, just before she was scheduled to speak at a OneCoin event in Lisbon, Ruja boarded a Ryanair flight from Sofia to Athens and disappeared. She hasn't been seen since. Her sudden vanishing stunned followers and investigators alike. At first, people believed she'd gone into hiding to avoid arrest. But as time passed, rumors swirled. Had she undergone plastic surgery and assumed a new identity? Was she hiding in the Middle East? Eastern Europe? Russia? Had she been killed by associates afraid of exposure? The FBI later charged her in absentia with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Her brother, Konstantin Ignatov, was arrested in Los Angeles in 2019 and later pleaded guilty. He testified that Ruja had planned her escape carefully, complete with fake documents and large amounts of cash. She had anticipated the collapse of her empire and vanished just in time. In 2022, Ruja Ignatova was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. A $250,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. Despite global attention, no confirmed sightings have emerged. She remains a ghost, possibly alive, possibly dead, but certainly out of reach. Meanwhile, thousands of victims are left picking up the pieces. Some lost savings, homes, even their marriages. Others, shamed by their involvement, have never come forward. The damage stretched across continents and classes, from small-time investors to seasoned financiers. The OneCoin saga remains one of the most brazen financial frauds of the 21st century, not only for its scale but for how convincingly it exploited a moment in history. Ruja tapped into a global hunger for change, cloaked herself in legitimacy, and vanished before the truth could catch her. In the end, she didn't need a real cryptocurrency. She needed only to sell the idea of one. In a world eager for miracles and too confused to question them, that was more than enough. The banker of bogus bills, Jérôme Kerviel, and the €50 billion bet. In the marble corridors of Société Générale, one of France's oldest and most prestigious banks, a quiet young man in a modest suit made trades that rivaled the GDP of small countries. He wasn't a high-level executive or the head of a trading desk. Jérôme Kerviel was a mid-level junior trader, a face most managers passed in the hallway without recognition. And yet, in 2008, his unauthorized trade spiraled into one of the largest financial scandals in banking history. €50 billion in risk exposure, nearly €5 billion in losses, and a global bank teetering on the edge of collapse. Kerviel didn't fit the typical image of a rogue trader. He was born in Pont-à-l'Abbé, a quiet town in Brittany, and studied modestly, not at elite grandes écoles, but at provincial universities. He joined Société Générale in the back office, learning the rules and routines of the trading world from the ground up. That knowledge would eventually become his greatest weapon. By 2005, he was promoted to the Delta One desk, a department that handled arbitrage and derivative trading. The risk was supposed to be low, the trades boring. But Jérôme wasn't interested in playing it safe. Over time, he began placing larger bets, first within the system, then quietly outside it. He had discovered a loophole. Kerviel would place a legitimate-looking trade and then secretly cancel or offset it with a fake transaction. He knew how to hide these actions deep within the system's internal workflows. The bank's risk controls, designed to flag suspicious trades, were built to detect outsiders, not someone who already knew the rulebook. Using this method, he amassed positions so vast that they dwarfed the bank's official exposure. At one point, he had placed €50 billion in unauthorized trades, more than the entire market value of Société Générale itself. When asked, he claimed his positions were hedged or balanced. The fake trades he created supported that illusion. For nearly 2 years it worked. But in January 2008, just as the global financial crisis began to unravel the world economy, an internal audit flagged unusual transactions. A deeper dive revealed the truth. Kerviel had created a massive web of fictitious trades and was operating far beyond his limits. Société Générale scrambled to unwind his positions, doing so quietly over a weekend to avoid triggering panic. But it was too late. In just 3 days, the bank lost €4.9 billion, more than any rogue trader had ever cost an institution. When the news broke, it shook France. The media dubbed Kerviel the man who lost billions, while politicians demanded answers. How could such staggering bets go unnoticed? Where were the controls? Who was really to blame? Kerviel was arrested and charged with breach of trust, forgery, and unauthorized use of the bank's systems. In court, he admitted to the trades, but claimed the bank had turned a blind eye as long as he was making money. He said his superiors had praised his profits, celebrated his success, and ignored the warning signs. When things went south, they scapegoated him. Société Générale denied the allegations. They painted Kerviel as a lone wolf, a manipulator who tricked the system and betrayed their trust. The court sided with the bank. In 2010, Kerviel was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 2 suspended, and ordered to repay the full €4.9 billion, a sum he would never be able to pay back. The ruling stunned observers. Critics argued that Société Générale's own negligence allowed the fraud to fester. Internal audits had failed to raise alarms. Kerviel's profits had ballooned without proper scrutiny. Some believed the bank had encouraged a culture of risk-taking, then disavowed it when it became inconvenient. The scandal raised troubling questions, not just about Kerviel's actions but about the banking industry itself. How much risk do institutions really understand? How many traders are operating just within the bounds of plausibility? And when billions are at stake, who is held accountable? Kerviel served just over a year in prison. After his release, he became an unlikely symbol of systemic failure. A man who had bent the rules, yes, but perhaps only because the system allowed him to. He wrote a book, gave interviews, and even completed a symbolic pilgrimage from Rome to Paris on foot, asking for forgiveness and accountability in finance. Years later, a French court reduced the amount he owed from €4.9 billion to just €1 million, acknowledging the bank's role in the affair. Still, the damage to his life was irreversible, and the scars left on the banking world remain. The Jérôme Kerviel case didn't just expose a fraud. It revealed a deeper truth. Sometimes the most dangerous traders aren't in it for personal gain, but for glory, recognition, and the illusion of control. And in a world where systems rely on trust and complexity, one person, armed with just enough knowledge and ambition, can bring the entire thing crashing down. The Mayor, the Mansion, and the Millions, Rita Crundwell's small-town empire. In the quiet heartland of Dixon, Illinois, a town of just 16,000 people known more for its cornfields than controversy, Rita Crundwell was a fixture. The town's longtime comptroller, she was trusted, reliable, and seemingly tireless. She managed Dixon's finances for decades and was often praised for her efficiency, especially in tight budget years. But behind her modest office door, Rita Crundwell was engineering one of the largest municipal frauds in American history. Over the course of 22 years, she embezzled nearly $54 million from the city. The scale of the crime wasn't just staggering, it was surgical, hidden in plain sight, and fueled by a desire not for power, but for horses. It began in 1990, just 2 years after Crundwell was promoted to comptroller. She opened a secret bank account in the name of Reserve Sewer Capital Development Account. A name so dull and bureaucratic, it raised no red flags. She alone had access to it. Then year after year she began funneling city funds into that account. To make the theft invisible, she delayed payments, fabricated invoices, and explained budget shortfalls away with tales of delayed state funding. City officials trusted her. After all, she'd worked at City Hall since high school. When questions arose, she answered them with such confidence that few thought to dig deeper. Meanwhile, her lifestyle was anything but subtle. Crundwell began acquiring quarter horses, fast, expensive animals used in elite breeding competitions. She bought more than 400 of them, becoming a major figure on the national show circuit. Her horses won awards, her name appeared in industry magazines, and her ranch, RC Quarter Horses, became a multi-million-dollar operation. She lived in a sprawling estate just outside of town, complete with a custom-built arena, stables, trailers, and a fleet of trucks. She traveled frequently to shows across the country and spent lavishly on jewelry, designer clothing, and even a luxury motorhome. Despite her government salary of around $80,000 a year, she was living like royalty. Residents began to wonder, how could a public servant afford all this? But small towns run on trust, and in Dixon, Rita had earned hers. The unraveling began not through high-tech investigation, but simple curiosity. In 2011, while Crundwell was on vacation, a city clerk covering her duties stumbled upon a suspicious bank statement addressed to a P.O. box. The account wasn't listed in the city's official finances. Alarmed, the clerk took it to the mayor. The mayor quietly contacted the FBI. Federal agents launched a quiet investigation. They followed the money, uncovered the fake account, and tracked the wire transfers from Dixon's legitimate funds into Rita's private empire. The scale of the theft shocked even seasoned investigators. In April 2012, Crundwell was arrested at City Hall. The town was stunned. At a press conference, the FBI announced that she had stolen more than $53 million over 2 decades. Many residents refused to believe it. Some even defended her, until the evidence became undeniable. Faced with overwhelming proof, Crundwell pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. She showed little emotion in court, even as prosecutors detailed her methodical plundering of the town's finances. In 2013, she was sentenced to 19 years and 7 months in federal prison. The government seized and auctioned off her assets, horses, vehicles, homes, and luxury goods, recovering around $9 million. But the city of Dixon, left with crumbling infrastructure and gutted reserves, remained traumatized. Perhaps the most painful aspect was how easily it had happened. There had been no sophisticated hacking, no elaborate con. Just a trusted employee who knew how to manipulate the system year after year, and a town too trusting to question her. After the scandal, Dixon instituted strict financial controls and annual audits, changes that came far too late. Rita Crundwell's story is often cited in fraud prevention seminars and government oversight programs. But for the people of Dixon, it's not a cautionary tale, it's a wound. One that took decades to open and years to begin healing. In a world filled with billion-dollar schemes and corporate frauds, Crundwell's crime was uniquely devastating, not because of how much she took, but because of who she took it from. A town that believed in her and paid the price. The Ghost of Silicon Valley, Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos Illusion. In the heart of Silicon Valley, where innovation is currency and image can outweigh substance, Elizabeth Holmes rose like a star. With her black turtlenecks, piercing gaze, and husky, calculated voice, she modeled herself after Steve Jobs. She promised a healthcare revolution, technology that could test for hundreds of diseases using just a single drop of blood. Her company, Theranos, was valued at over $9 billion. Investors lined up. Politicians, military generals, and media moguls joined her board. But there was one critical flaw: the technology didn't work. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19 with a vision. She wanted to eliminate the pain and inefficiency of traditional blood testing. With a few drops from a finger prick, her device, called the Edison, would diagnose everything from cancer to cholesterol levels in real time. It sounded like science fiction, but Holmes claimed it was already science fact. She was convincing. Backed by her youth, confidence, and compelling origin story, Holmes raised hundreds of millions of dollars from influential investors. Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, and Betsy DeVos all bought in. Former Secretary of State George Shultz joined the board. So did retired Marine General James Mattis. But inside Theranos, engineers and scientists were panicking. The Edison machines didn't work. They gave wildly inaccurate results, often failing basic quality checks. When tests were run on real patients, the company secretly used traditional lab equipment, disguising the process to look automated. Staff were pressured into silence. Those who questioned the technology were fired or threatened with lawsuits. Still, Holmes pushed forward. She secured deals with Walgreens and Safeway to roll out Theranos devices in stores across the country. The media hailed her as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She graced magazine covers, spoke at tech conferences, and even gave a TED Talk. All the while, Theranos was built on deception. The house of cards began to wobble in 2015, when Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou began investigating the company. Using whistleblower accounts from former employees, he published a series of damning exposés. Theranos was not only lying about its capabilities, it was putting patients at risk with faulty test results. Holmes denied everything. She went on television, gave interviews, and accused critics of trying to stifle innovation. But the evidence was piling up. Federal regulators launched investigations. Walgreens and other partners cut ties. Patients who had received false diagnoses filed lawsuits. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Theranos voided thousands of test results. Its value plummeted. By 2018, the company dissolved. That same year, Holmes and former Theranos president Ramesh Sunny Balwani were charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Prosecutors claimed they had deliberately misled investors and patients while knowing the technology didn't work. Holmes maintained her innocence. The courtroom drama stretched on for years. In 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud. Her carefully curated persona, once the symbol of disruption and genius, had crumbled under cross-examination. She was sentenced to over 11 years in prison. Balwani received an even longer sentence, nearly 13 years. Theranos had raised more than $700 million. It promised to change the world, and for a while people believed it had. But in the end, it was a facade, propped up by secrecy, marketing, and the allure of a perfect solution. What made the fraud so chilling wasn't just the money lost, it was the betrayal of trust in medicine, in science, and in hope. Real patients relied on Theranos test results. Some delayed treatment, others panicked over false alarms. The consequences were not just financial, they were deeply personal. Elizabeth Holmes became a symbol, not just of fraud, but of what happens when image eclipses truth. In Silicon Valley, where "fake it till you make it" is often celebrated, she took the mantra too far. Her fall from grace serves as a reminder that even in a world chasing innovation, some lines cannot be crossed. And when they are, the fallout isn't just reputational, it's human. The king of carbon credits, Arne Meinert, and the environmental mirage. In an age of climate anxiety, carbon credits emerged as a way to balance the scales, letting companies offset pollution by investing in eco-friendly projects. It was a system built on trust. Forests preserved, emissions traded, and the promise of a greener future. But in Germany, one man saw not a path to sustainability, but to staggering personal wealth. Arne Meinert didn't look like a con man. With his soft-spoken manner and polished presentations, he appeared every bit the responsible entrepreneur. He launched a company called EcoGreen International, which claimed to sell high-quality carbon credits from reforestation and conservation projects across South America and Africa. Clients ranged from small investors to multinational corporations. The pitch was clean, modern, and virtuous. By purchasing these credits, companies could reduce their carbon footprints and boost their environmental image. But the forests were imaginary. And the credits? Worthless. Between 2010 and 2014, Minard built a complex operation that appeared legitimate on paper. He leased upscale office space in Hamburg, hired sales staff, and crafted glossy brochures with lush rainforest imagery and official-sounding partnerships. EcoGreen claimed to work with NGOs and indigenous communities to protect vast swaths of endangered land. In return, carbon credits would be issued based on the amount of CO2 supposedly prevented from entering the atmosphere. Investors were promised both impact and returns. As the global carbon market grew, Minard assured them the value of their credits would increase. He even dangled the prospect of trading them on international exchanges. For environmentally conscious firms eager to polish their credentials, it was an easy sell. The fraud worked because of how opaque the carbon market can be. Many buyers didn't fully understand how offsets were measured or verified. They took Minard's certificates at face value. And he flooded the market with them. Millions of euros worth sold to clients in Germany, the UK, and beyond. Inside EcoGreen's offices, the operation ran like a boiler room. Cold callers pressured retirees and small businesses to invest, touting massive returns and limited-time opportunities. Some victims sunk their savings into the scheme, believing they were backing a noble cause. But there were no forests, no third-party verification, and no carbon being offset. Minard had simply invented entire projects, fabricated GPS coordinates, created fake partnership documents, and forged audit reports. Many of the supposedly protected lands didn't even exist. Others were privately owned or under no threat at all. The walls began to close in when a few savvy investors requested documentation to verify their credits. When responses were vague or delayed, they raised complaints. German financial regulators started looking into EcoGreen's filings and quickly found discrepancies. When investigators raided the company's offices in 2014, they uncovered a trove of fake documents, forged certificates, and empty financial promises. Minard had siphoned more than 70 million euros through the scheme, channeling it into offshore accounts, luxury cars, and real estate across Europe. At the time of his arrest, he was negotiating new deals in Asia, expanding the scam before it collapsed. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and money laundering. In court, Minard claimed that he had started with good intentions, and that some projects had been real, though even he couldn't prove which ones. The judge, unmoved, called his actions a betrayal not only of investors, but of the environment. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The damage extended far beyond lost money. Companies that had trusted EcoGreen now faced scrutiny over false sustainability claims. Some were fined for reporting fictitious carbon offsets. For the carbon market, it was a reputational hit at a critical time. The scandal highlighted a deeper flaw: the voluntary carbon market's lack of oversight. Without standardized verification or enforcement, it had become a haven for fraudsters like Minard, who saw an opportunity not to heal the planet but to exploit it. In the aftermath, calls grew louder for reform. Governments began tightening rules. Third-party verification agencies gained prominence. But the shadow of EcoGreen still lingers. Arne Minard showed how easily green ideals can be manipulated, how virtue can become a sales pitch, and how climate change, the world's greatest challenge, can also become its most lucrative lie. The heiress who wasn't, the curious case of Clark Rockefeller. In the rarefied world of the American East Coast elite, names matter. And no name opened more doors than Rockefeller. So when a soft-spoken, well-dressed man introduced himself as Clark Rockefeller, descended from the famed oil dynasty, few questioned him. He had the accent, the tailored suits, the aloof charm. He collected art. He discussed high finance and rare wines. He seemed born into privilege. But Clark Rockefeller didn't exist. His real name was Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, a German immigrant who had reinvented himself dozens of times across America. His long, winding con would span decades, destroy lives, and eventually reveal a darker, more sinister past than anyone expected. Christian arrived in the U.S. in the late 1970s as a teenager. He overstayed his visa and began crafting identities, each one slightly more convincing than the last. At times, he claimed to be a baron, a television producer, or an aristocrat. He blended charm with a peculiar arrogance, and more often than not, it worked. By the early 1990s, he had adopted the Rockefeller persona full-time. He moved to Manhattan, hobnobbed with the wealthy, and married Sandra Boss, a successful Harvard-educated business consultant who worked for McKinsey and Company. She believed he was a Rockefeller, albeit eccentric. He controlled the relationship tightly, insisting on privacy, handling all finances, and even keeping her from meeting his family. Their lifestyle was opulent but odd. Clark didn't appear to have a job. He claimed to consult for government agencies or manage private wealth. When pressed, he would pivot with vague references to national security or family trust restrictions. Sandra, who was often traveling for work, grew suspicious. But by then they had a daughter. Eventually the marriage dissolved. During the divorce proceedings, Sandra discovered the truth. Her husband had no Rockefeller lineage. In fact, he had no verified background at all. She was granted custody of their daughter and a restraining order against him. But in 2008, during a supervised visit in Boston, Clark abducted his daughter, Rye. He overpowered the social worker, fled in a waiting vehicle, and disappeared without a trace. An Amber Alert was issued. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Authorities traced him through a series of clues: a prepaid cell phone, a fake address, and an alias, Chip Smith, a yacht salesman in Baltimore. A week later, the FBI arrested him. Rye was recovered unharmed. The story stunned the nation. But it didn't end there. As investigators dug deeper into Clark's past, they connected him to a long cold case in California, the 1985 disappearance of John and Linda Sohus, a young couple from San Marino. At the time, Christian, then going by the name Christopher Chichester, had been living in their guest house. Shortly after the Sohuses vanished, he left town. Years later, John Sohus's remains were found buried in the backyard. Christian was charged with murder in 2011 and stood trial in 2013. The evidence was largely circumstantial but damning. His sudden disappearance, his use of John's identity afterward, and forensic evidence tying him to the burial site. He was convicted and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. In the end, Christian Carl Gerhartsreiter, alias Clark Rockefeller, Christopher Chichester, Chip Smith, and many others, had built an entire life on lies. He moved through society like a ghost in a tailored suit, convincing some of the smartest people in the country that he was someone else entirely. What made his cons so effective wasn't just his ability to lie, it was people's willingness to believe. He weaponized class assumptions, leveraging the Rockefeller name like a golden key. In a society obsessed with pedigree and status, he understood that perception often outweighed proof. His story became the subject of documentaries, books, and psychological studies. Experts debated whether he was a sociopath, a pathological liar, or simply an opportunist. But for his victims, especially the families he deceived and the lives he disrupted, those labels hardly mattered. The tale of Clark Rockefeller remains one of the strangest and most chilling cases of long-form fraud in American history. A man who forged not just documents, but an entire identity, manipulating those around him for decades, until his own fiction finally turned fatal. The billionaire mirage, Alan Stanford and the Caribbean Ponzi scheme. At first glance, Sir Alan Stanford appeared to be the embodiment of American success. With his salt and pepper beard, Texan charm, and a private jet fleet stamped with his personal crest, he commanded the room like a man born to power. He hosted lavish cricket tournaments, donated to universities, shook hands with presidents, and was even knighted by the Antiguan government. His empire, the Stanford Financial Group, promised safety and sophistication to thousands of investors around the world. At the heart of it was a seemingly simple offer: high-yield certificates of deposit, CDs, issued through his offshore bank in Antigua, offering returns far above any American bank. What few knew was that the money was never being invested. It was fueling a fraud that would become the second-largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Stanford's pitch was irresistible to many. The CDs, marketed through his subsidiary Stanford International Bank, offered steady returns of 10% or more, supposedly derived from a mix of conservative foreign investments and real estate holdings. The company claimed transparency, safety, and elite banking practices. He built trust through appearances. His Houston offices were dripping in marble. His staff wore uniforms. Clients received glossy brochures and detailed reports outlining portfolio strength and security. He sponsored sports events, political campaigns, and public health programs. It all looked real. By the early 2000s, Stanford controlled more than $7 billion in investor assets. Most of it came from retirees, middle-class professionals, and even churches who had been told their money was being carefully managed overseas. But inside the Stanford empire, it was chaos. The CDs were a lie. Stanford and his inner circle weren't investing the deposits. Instead, they were using the funds to pay earlier investors, classic Ponzi behavior, and to finance Stanford's lavish lifestyle. He purchased private islands, operated a fleet of jets, and lived in a massive estate in the Caribbean. He surrounded himself with models, hosted private parties for celebrities, and claimed he was too big to fail. As the scheme grew, so did his delusions of grandeur. He presented himself as a banking innovator and philanthropic leader. In 2006, he donated millions to promote cricket in the West Indies, famously awarding a $20 million prize to the winning team of a single match. Cameras flashed. Athletes cheered. The illusion deepened. But the cracks began to form as early as 2008, during the global financial crisis. Investors wanted to pull out their money, and Stanford couldn't deliver. Rumors spread. Whistleblowers began talking. A former employee alerted the SEC, describing in detail how the CD program was fabricated. The SEC launched an investigation. In February 2009, the House of Cards collapsed. Stanford was arrested and charged with orchestrating a $7 billion fraud. Prosecutors described his company as a massive Ponzi scheme, one that preyed on trust, appearance, and a network of complicit financial advisors. In court, Stanford denied everything. He claimed the company was legitimate, the investments real, and the charges politically motivated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial statements, and testimony from former executives made it clear. The CDs were worthless, the returns fabricated, and the books cooked for years. In 2012, Alan Stanford was convicted on 13 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The fallout was devastating. More than 21,000 investors across 113 countries lost life savings. Many had been lured in by glowing recommendations from advisors who were paid to push Stanford's products. The Antiguan economy, once bolstered by Stanford's investments, plunged into financial crisis. His knighthood was revoked. His assets were seized. And his name, once tied to prestige, became synonymous with deception. Unlike Bernie Madoff, who expressed some remorse for his crimes, Stanford maintained his innocence to the end. Even in prison, he insisted he was a victim of government overreach. But the numbers told a different story. Billions gone, lives shattered, and a decade-long fraud that operated behind the smoke and mirrors of one man's ego. Stanford's case exposed glaring weaknesses in international banking oversight. His operations in Antigua were largely unregulated, and his American branches functioned with minimal scrutiny. By spreading his empire across jurisdictions, he had stayed one step ahead, until he couldn't. In the end, Alan Stanford didn't just steal money. He stole security, hope, and trust. He created a fantasy, then sold it to the world. And for a time, the world believed him. The fake tech titan, Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos deception. In the sun-drenched valleys of Silicon Valley, where bold dreams and billion-dollar startups bloom overnight, few stories captured the imagination like that of Elizabeth Holmes. At just 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford University, abandoning a promising academic career for a vision to revolutionize healthcare with technology so groundbreaking it would change the world. She promised a future where blood testing, a routine medical procedure often dreaded for its pain and wait times, could be transformed into a fast, cheap, and virtually painless experience using just a few drops of blood from a simple finger prick. Her company, Theranos, was founded in 2003. From the outset, Holmes was a master of storytelling and image crafting. She adopted a signature look of black turtlenecks reminiscent of Steve Jobs, projecting an aura of visionary leadership that captivated investors and the media alike. Holmes's voice was husky and measured, commanding attention and conveying a sense of quiet certainty. Backed by a powerful board of advisors including former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, retired generals and Silicon Valley heavyweights, Theranos quickly rose to prominence. By 2014, the company was valued at nearly $10 billion, making Holmes one of the youngest self-made female billionaires. High-profile partners like Walgreens and Safeway signed agreements to offer Theranos blood tests in their stores, while investors poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the startup. The promise was seductive. No more needles, no more long waits for test results, and the ability to screen for hundreds of diseases and conditions from a single drop of blood. Hospitals and doctors hailed the potential breakthrough. Patients were eager to embrace the future of diagnostics. The media dubbed Holmes a visionary, a disruptor on the scale of Jobs or Gates. But behind the scenes, the story was far darker. Theranos' proprietary devices, the Edison machines, failed repeatedly in the lab. Engineers struggled with malfunctioning hardware and unreliable test results that often contradicted conventional blood testing methods. Despite this, Holmes and her executive team continued to claim that the technology was ready for market, concealing its shortcomings from investors, partners, regulators, and the public. When external labs began demanding samples for confirmatory testing, Theranos resorted to a deceptive tactic, sending most samples to traditional, FDA-approved machines while insisting the results were generated by their own devices. This ruse went undetected for years. Inside Theranos, a culture of fear and secrecy prevailed. Employees who raised concerns about the technology's failings faced intimidation, demotions, or outright dismissal. Whistleblowers would later come forward to reveal how they were pressured to manipulate data and silence internal dissent. Confidentiality agreements and legal threats kept many silent, while Holmes projected confidence and optimism at every public appearance. The illusion unraveled beginning in 2015 when John Carreyrou, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, began investigating the company. Through interviews with former employees and confidential documents, Carreyrou exposed the fraud. Theranos technology was inaccurate, unreliable, and in some cases, potentially dangerous. His series of investigative articles ignited regulatory scrutiny. Federal agencies, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services (CMS), conducted inspections and audits. Regulators found widespread issues: inaccurate tests, flawed lab practices, and failures to meet safety standards. Walgreens ended its partnership. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) filed civil charges alleging a multi-million-dollar fraud against Holmes and Theranos. In 2018, Holmes and former President Sunny Balwani were indicted on multiple criminal counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud investors and patients. Prosecutors painted a picture of a company built on lies, where Holmes knew the truth about the failing technology but deliberately misled everyone to keep the money flowing. The trial, which lasted months, offered a stark contrast between Holmes's public persona and the reality of Theranos' operations. Witnesses testified about manipulated test results, fearful employees, and a leadership style that brooked no challenge. Holmes's defense argued she genuinely believed in the technology and did not intend to defraud investors or patients. In January 2022, after weeks of deliberations, the jury found Holmes guilty on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. Balwani was convicted separately and sentenced to nearly 13 years. The fallout from Theranos' collapse was far-reaching. Thousands of patients who relied on its tests faced uncertainty, with some receiving incorrect diagnoses or delayed treatments. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The company's implosion became a cautionary tale about the perils of hype over substance, especially in industries where lives hang in the balance. More than a story of financial deception, Theranos exposed how Silicon Valley's culture of disruption and fake it till you make it can sometimes cross the line into outright fraud. It showed how charisma and ambition can blind intelligent people, how fear and secrecy can suffocate truth, and how the desire to be a visionary can lead to devastating consequences. Elizabeth Holmes's story is not just about a failed startup. It is about the fragile nature of trust in science, the seduction of promise, and the human cost when technology is rushed before it's ready. In the end, the miracle blood test was just that, a mirage that vanished under scrutiny, leaving behind shattered lives and hard lessons. The Shadow Banker, the collapse of Barings and Nick Leeson's rogue trades. Barings Bank was an institution synonymous with tradition, prestige, and centuries of financial expertise. Founded in 1762, it had financed empires, monarchs, and major global trade ventures, earning a reputation as one of the most respected merchant banks in the world. Yet, in 1995, the venerable bank's storied history came to an abrupt and catastrophic end, brought down not by economic downturn or scandal at the top, but by the reckless, secretive actions of one man, Nick Leeson. Leeson, a brash and ambitious young trader, began working for Barings in the early 1980s. By 1992, he had been promoted to head of the futures trading operations on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange. His role was straightforward on paper: make profitable trades in futures contracts and options, helping the bank capitalize on market movements in Asia. But Leeson's appetite for risk and desire for quick success would lead him down a dangerous path. Initially, Leeson's trades appeared successful. He reported steady profits, and his managers, eager for gains in an increasingly competitive market, trusted him implicitly. But the reality was far different. Leeson had started placing unauthorized speculative bets on the Japanese stock market, particularly on the Nikkei 225 index. When these positions moved against him, he chose to hide his mounting losses rather than report them. To conceal his failures, Leeson created a secret error account, known internally as account 88888, where he funneled losing trades. Instead of alerting supervisors or adjusting his positions, he doubled down, placing increasingly risky bets in an effort to recover the losses. This gamble was a dangerous game of bluff, relying on the hope that the market would turn in his favor before the deception was uncovered. A critical weakness that allowed Leeson's fraud to continue unchecked was his unusual control over both the front office, where trades were made, and the back office, where trades were settled and recorded. Normally, these functions are strictly separated to prevent conflicts of interest. But in Singapore, Leeson managed both, allowing him to manipulate records and hide his activities from auditors and risk managers. For nearly 2 years, Leeson's secret grew. He falsified reports, hid losses, and submitted false profit statements. The bank's internal controls, designed to catch such discrepancies, were either insufficient or ignored in the rush for profits. Then, in January 1995, the fragile house of cards collapsed. The devastating Kobe earthquake struck Japan, causing a sharp and sudden drop in the Nikkei market. Leeson's massive speculative positions went deeply underwater. The losses he had concealed in account 88888 erupted, exposing a staggering deficit of £827 million, twice the bank's available capital. Barings was on the brink of insolvency. The revelation sent shockwaves through the global financial community. How could a bank with centuries of experience be brought down by one man? The British government refused to bail out the institution. Instead, Barings was sold to the Dutch bank ING for the nominal sum of £1. Leeson fled Singapore but was soon arrested in Germany and extradited back to face charges. At trial, he pleaded guilty to fraud and deception, accepting responsibility for the collapse. Sentenced to 6.5 years in a Singapore prison, Leeson served 4 before his release. The fallout from the Barings collapse was immense. It shook investor confidence and led to sweeping changes in risk management and regulatory oversight in banks worldwide. The scandal revealed how inadequate controls and unchecked ambition could allow a single individual to exploit an entire system. It underscored the dangers of over-centralizing authority and the importance of transparency. Leeson's story is a stark, cautionary tale, a reminder that in finance, no legacy is invulnerable to the consequences of deception, greed, and human error. It exposed the fragility lurking beneath the polished veneer of banking's elite, proving that even the mightiest institutions can fall victim to the shadowy risks within. The Swiss Bank Heist, The Art of Deception by Gerard Tessin. Switzerland has long been synonymous with banking secrecy, stability, and trust. Its banks, nestled in the shadow of the Alps, have served as guardians of some of the world's largest fortunes. The polished marble halls of Geneva and Zurich hold billions in assets, with privacy assured as a fundamental right. For many wealthy clients, Swiss banks represent security and discretion. But even in this fortress of financial confidence, cracks can appear, sometimes carved by the very people entrusted to protect it. Gerard Tessin was one such individual. A French-born accountant with impeccable credentials, he joined a prestigious Swiss private bank in Geneva in the early 2000s. His role was ostensibly straightforward: to manage complex client portfolios, advise ultra-wealthy customers on their investments, and maintain the bank's reputation for discretion and reliability. But Tessin was not content with merely doing his job. Over time, he grew increasingly emboldened. With privileged access to client accounts and internal banking systems, he began crafting an elaborate scheme to steal from the very clients he was supposed to serve. What made Tessin's fraud so insidious was its complexity and subtlety. Unlike brazen theft or obvious embezzlement, Tessin worked quietly behind the scenes, exploiting his deep knowledge of accounting, auditing, and Swiss banking protocols to cover his tracks. He created fictitious accounts in the names of shell companies, carefully layered with false documents and forged signatures. Transactions were routed through an intricate network of offshore entities in Europe and the Caribbean, designed to obscure the origin and destination of funds. By manipulating the bank's internal records, Tessin masked unauthorized withdrawals and asset transfers as legitimate investment activity. For years the scheme went unnoticed. Client statements appeared accurate and balanced, and Tessin's colleagues regarded him as meticulous and trustworthy. Even internal audits failed to detect the irregularities. The forged documents and expertly falsified reports gave no cause for suspicion. The total amount stolen grew into the hundreds of millions, with estimates exceeding $150 million. The funds financed an opulent lifestyle far removed from the humble accountant's beginnings. Luxury homes, high-end vehicles, and investments in art and real estate all flowed from the illicit gains. Yet no deception lasts forever. The first sign of trouble emerged when a newly appointed compliance officer spotted subtle discrepancies in client account statements during a routine review. Certain wire transfers did not match corresponding records. Some signatures on documents appeared inconsistent. These small flags prompted a deeper investigation. Swiss financial authorities quickly became involved, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in France, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. The tangled web of shell companies and cross-border transfers made the probe challenging and lengthy. In 2010, after months of surveillance and forensic accounting, Gérard Tessin was arrested at his home in France. His computers and personal files contained mountains of fabricated documents, spreadsheets, and emails detailing the cover-up. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who used his professional expertise to betray trust on a grand scale. Tessin maintained he had started with good intentions but had become ensnared in a spiral of greed and deception. The court sentenced him to over 10 years in prison, marking one of the most significant private banking fraud convictions in Swiss history. The repercussions were profound. The scandal damaged the reputation of Swiss private banking, once considered untouchable. It triggered regulatory reforms aimed at increasing transparency, strengthening compliance, and imposing stricter oversight on account managers and back-office operations. Clients became more cautious, demanding better audits and verification. Banks began collaborating more closely with international authorities to prevent money laundering and financial crimes. Gérard Tessin's story is a stark reminder that even the most trusted institutions are vulnerable when ambition and greed intersect with opportunity. It illustrates how a single individual, armed with skill and insider access, can exploit systemic weaknesses to devastating effect. More than a crime of numbers, it is a tale of betrayal, of trust shattered behind the velvet curtains of privilege. In the world of high finance, where millions change hands in seconds, vigilance remains the only defense against the art of deception. The Vampire of Wall Street, the deceptive rise and fall of Jordan Belfort. In the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled world of Wall Street during the late 1980s and early 1990s, fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Among the myriad players jockeying for position, one man stood out, not for his prudence or foresight, but for his extraordinary ability to manipulate the system. Jordan Belfort's story is one of ambition run wild, charisma weaponized, and a financial empire built on lies and greed. A man who would become infamous as the Wolf of Wall Street. Born in 1962 in Queens, New York, Belfort began his career modestly, working as a door-to-door meat and seafood salesman. He was a natural salesman, quick-talking and persuasive, traits that would serve him well later. His entry into the stock brokerage world was unremarkable at first. After losing his job at a reputable firm during the 1987 stock market crash, he founded his own company, Stratton Oakmont, in 1989. From the start, Stratton Oakmont operated differently than traditional firms. Belfort's approach was aggressive, unapologetically focused on rapid, high-volume sales rather than sustainable investment strategies. The company specialized in pump-and-dump schemes, where they would artificially inflate the price of small, illiquid stocks, often penny stocks with little to no real value, through high-pressure sales tactics. Once the stock price was pumped up, the firm's insiders would sell off their holdings at a massive profit, leaving investors holding worthless shares when the price inevitably collapsed. Belfort's office culture was wild and excessive. Stratton Oakmont's brokers were trained to use psychological manipulation over the phone, convincing clients to invest beyond their means and assuring them of guaranteed profits. The firm's headquarters resembled a trading floor from a movie. Loud, chaotic, with ringing phones and brokers fueled by drugs and adrenaline. Belfort himself lived a life of extreme indulgence. Lavish parties, exotic cars, yachts, and drugs were staples. His charisma was magnetic. He was both revered and feared by employees. Belfort preached a ruthless mantra: money was everything and rules were made to be broken. He called himself the Vampire of Wall Street, a nickname that fit his predatory business style. But the very practices that brought him wealth and notoriety also attracted regulatory attention. Throughout the early 1990s, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the FBI received increasing complaints from defrauded investors. However, Stratton Oakmont's operations were complex and opaque. Belfort and his associates created layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, obscuring the trail of money and confusing investigators. Despite growing scrutiny, Stratton Oakmont continued expanding. At its peak, the firm employed over 1,000 brokers and managed to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from unsuspecting investors. But internal problems surfaced as discontent grew, and some brokers leaked information to regulators. In 1996, the SEC filed charges against Stratton Oakmont. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, uncovering evidence of securities fraud and money laundering. Belfort's empire began to crumble. Facing decades in prison, Belfort made a decision to cooperate with authorities. He provided extensive testimony against his partners and helped trace the misappropriated funds. His cooperation significantly reduced his own sentence. In 2003, Belfort was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison but served just 22 months. Following his release, he reinvented himself as a motivational speaker and author. His memoir, The Wolf of Wall Street, became a bestseller, later adapted into a major Hollywood film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, which glamorized and dramatized his exploits. Yet beneath the glitz and scandal lies a cautionary tale of devastation. Thousands of investors, many ordinary people, lost millions of dollars. Retirement savings vanished, dreams shattered. The regulatory reforms and watchdog agencies intensified efforts to prevent such frauds, but Belfort's story remains a stark reminder of how charm and deceit can manipulate markets and exploit trust. The Wolf of Wall Street epitomizes the dangers lurking within unchecked ambition and moral bankruptcy. His rise and fall show how the lust for wealth, when coupled with manipulation and disregard for ethics, can wreak havoc not just on markets but on lives. His story continues to fascinate and warn that beneath the glamorous facade of financial success, darkness can breed, where greed consumes and trust is the ultimate casualty. The Great British Fraud, The Downfall of Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell's life story reads like a novel, filled with drama, reinvention, and tragedy. Born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hack in 1923 in Czechoslovakia, he endured the horrors of Nazi concentration camps during World War II. Miraculously surviving, he emigrated to Britain, where he would build a media empire that earned him power, wealth, and influence far beyond his humble beginnings. But beneath the veneer of success lay a complex web of financial deception that would shatter trust and leave thousands devastated. Maxwell was a man of contradictions. A self-made billionaire, he was both celebrated and feared. His charm and connections in political and social circles gave him access to the highest levels of British society, yet rumors of ruthless business tactics and shadowy dealings followed him everywhere. During the 1980s, Maxwell's media holdings grew rapidly. His company, Mirror Group Newspapers, owned the Daily Mirror, one of Britain's leading tabloids, along with numerous publishing houses. His business style was aggressive, marked by risky leveraged buyouts and a relentless appetite for expansion. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Maxwell's empire was heavily burdened by debt. To sustain his lavish lifestyle and sprawling business ventures, he began diverting funds from one part of his empire to cover shortfalls in another, a precarious balancing act that was destined to collapse. On November 5, 1991, Robert Maxwell's life came to a sudden and mysterious end. While aboard his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter, he fell overboard near the Canary Islands and drowned. His death was ruled an accident, but it triggered an intense investigation into his financial affairs. What emerged was shocking. Authorities discovered that Maxwell had systematically looted the pension funds of his companies, including the Mirror Group, to prop up failing businesses and maintain cash flow. Pension funds, which employees had trusted to secure their futures, had been raided to the tune of approximately £460 million. Maxwell used complex and deceitful accounting methods to hide the theft. False statements, forged documents, and intricate financial maneuvers masked the missing funds. His accountants and lawyers, whether knowingly complicit or not, failed to uncover the fraud during his lifetime. The consequences were devastating. Thousands of workers faced uncertainty as their retirement savings vanished overnight. Investors lost faith. The British government stepped in to stabilize the situation, taking control of some of Maxwell's companies to protect jobs and pensions. The scandal became one of the largest pension frauds in British history and exposed serious flaws in corporate governance and pension regulation. It sparked public outrage and led to new laws aimed at protecting employees' pension rights and increasing transparency in financial reporting. In the wake of Maxwell's death and the subsequent revelations, his once mighty media empire unraveled. Companies were sold or broken up, and many of Maxwell's closest associates distanced themselves from the scandal. Maxwell's personal legacy is complex. To some, he was a survivor and self-made success story, a man who rose from war-torn Europe to the pinnacle of British business. To others, he was a ruthless fraudster whose greed betrayed the trust of countless individuals. His story remains a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the vulnerability of those who place faith in charismatic leaders. It reminds us that behind even the grandest fortunes, deception can lie hidden, waiting for the moment when the facade crumbles and the truth is revealed. Robert Maxwell's downfall serves as a stark reminder. No empire is invincible, and trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild.